This lecture is about feasibility assessment. So we're in the ideation phase of our design thinking process. And an important part of that work is to assess the feasibility of our work. So assessing feasibility is all about evaluating the potential failure points of your ideas. We're ultimately asking the question, is your idea attainable, and what will make or break your idea? Now, huge word of caution here. We really need to strike a balance between failing ideas quickly and trimming away the creativity and audacity. So it's important that you evaluate, are you really having the bold impact that you want? At XPRIZE, we used to talk about things being audacious and achievable at least once a day. That was our barometer for whether or not our work was kind of in the sweet spot. And so I want you to make sure that you keep that audacity intact while still evaluating, is it ultimately truly achievable? The design thinking world has a saying they like to say, which is that we want to fail ideas faster to succeed sooner. In fact, I think it was one of the IDEO founders that said that, or one of the D School founders that said that. But this is true. In a sense, we do want to fail ideas quickly, and we want to make sure that we're really setting ourselves up for success before we put in all the legwork or the investment into actually building the thing. And also part of that too is just staying in tune with your appetite for risk and your personal interests. But ultimately, this process is about assessing, what's it going to take for my idea to really work? So what the questions that we're going to ask is, what will prove you right or wrong, or what has to be true for this to be a good project? So you should really leave this exercise with the answers to those questions. But here's something important. It isn't really actually at this moment that you're going to say whether or not your idea will or won't work, unless you know certain things for sure. But what you're really going to try to walk away from this exercise with is, what do I need to know in order to conclude that it won't work? So you're really going to develop a set of research questions out of this, and things that you need to better understand about your technology or your approach. Unless you can really say with certainty, okay, the technology isn't there yet, this isn't clinically tested, hopefully you're sort of sitting on that edge of saying, I have some audacious ideas, but now I need to just make sure that what I think is right and that we really will be able to develop and execute this project. So I want to take you to a video from 2002 from a very, very famous political situation after 9/11. Okay, so I don't know if you all remember, but at the time, this was somewhat mocked, but ultimately there is a kernel of truth to what he said. And the truth is, even though he said it in a way that may be confusing, the reality is when we're at this feasibility assessment stage, there are definitely things that we know. There are things that we've researched and learned, and it's important to stay grounded in those. What we want to do is be aware of beliefs that are masquerading as facts. We also want to be careful to assess, is it something I know, or is this something that I'm assuming and accepting as truth? Those items we really want to make sure that we're investigating and that we kind of capture them, and it's part of our feasibility query. Are these assumptions really true? Do we think they'll hold? And a lot of times experts and other people who we might run design labs with, or users or stakeholders, can help us really assess our assumptions and make sure that they're reasonable. There's definitely a whole set of things that we don't know about but could know about. And the question here is, how are you going to find those things out? Because the idea is, if we can know them, we should know them as much as we possibly can. So this is really, what are the research queries that are going to come out of this feasibility process? And you may not be able to research every single one of these, but it's important that you figure out what are the most essential things that I don't know, and make sure that you find those out. And lastly, there are some things that you don't know and honestly can't know, like future events, things like that. But you really, all the takeaway here is, don't worry. Know that there are some blind spots. Know that there's some things that you can't plan for, and do your best to react to those when they arise. But ultimately, you can't really control that. So don't let it bog you down too much in the process. So a lot of what I've taken from the next slides is a lot of what I've presented in the next slides is from Jean Leidke and Tim Ogilvy's book, Designing for Growth, a Design Thinking Toolkit for Managers. And I strongly recommend you read the chapter. I think it's one of the best in the book. So let's take a look at some of the advice that they offer us. So they say assumption testing focuses on identifying the make or break elements of your concept and involves taking a cold, hard look at its key vulnerabilities. Right, and we're going to bring that critical eye, but we are going to step back and make sure that for us that we're also asking: Are we clipping its audacity? Are we trimming it? You know, is it making us nervous about its achievability? Because we don't want to really clip the risk. Next part of what they say is think of yourself as an entrepreneur making a pitch to a venture capitalist. You don't know enough to guarantee success, but you must be supremely confident that you've selected a worthwhile problem, which we are. We've got our grand challenges and all that problem development work we've done. You have the foundations of a novel and compelling solution that we're going to get out of our design work, but we're also going to have it justified and rooted in the research and things that we've learned. And lastly, that you have a clear view of the critical vulnerabilities and what it would take to test them. And that's really the part of this work that we are developing now. So again, let me read this because I think it's such a good, I want to read it one more time because I think it's such an important thing to take away from how we want to position this, because this really speaks to what is the goal of our capstone projects overall. So again, think of yourself as an entrepreneur making a pitch to a venture capitalist. You don't know enough to guarantee success, but you must be supremely confident that you've selected a worthwhile problem. You have the foundations of a novel and compelling solution, and you have a clear view of the critical vulnerabilities and what it would take to test them. So really hang on to that as the mission as we move through this process, and use that as kind of a barometer to make sure that all of the pieces are in place of your project. So another thing that they say is that most managers have been taught to take the information they've got and work with it. You are identifying the information you need and then figuring out how to get it. If there's one takeaway from design thinking, it's probably this. It's really identifying the information you need and figuring out how to get it. And the good news now is as a result of this class, we have a lot of tools that can help us. We've got our secondary and academic research and literature reviews. We've got our primary research and conversations. We've got design labs. We've got focus groups, conferences, panels, the internet. So we have a lot of ways of getting information. This is the information age after all. So part of the figuring out how to get it is really figuring out what's most important and how to use your time most efficiently, and making sure that you prioritize what are really the most important things that you need to learn, because you often can't dig into everything. So Designing for Growth recommends 4 tests that we can use to help us evaluate feasibility. And ultimately for them, part of feasibility is about assessing value. So this part of this inquiry really asks, are we adding value to our project? And this hinges to feasibility in the following way. If we really don't think that we're adding value to the marketplace, then people aren't going to adopt our idea, and it really ultimately won't succeed because people will not have bought into it. So the key part of establishing that people use and want to engage with your idea or ultimately adopt your intervention is whether or not it adds value. And for us, of course, value is, how well does it address the problem and have an impact in those sorts of things. So they describe the value test as, will this concept create superior value for them, meaning your stakeholders, your customers, and how much will they be willing to pay, and whether there are enough of them to constitute a market of sufficient size. Now, of course, our friends, Dr. Leidke and Tim Ogilvy are in this business realm. They're thinking about customers, so they're thinking about who's going to buy it. They're thinking about whether or not there's a market for it, and are we actually able to have a superior experience over the competition, right? So they're kind of in the standard market capitalist realm. But a lot of those things do apply. We still have funders. We often need people to pay for our work. We want to make sure that there's a sufficient interest in what we have to offer, and that it is different than what's currently available, or significantly different enough, because there is a cost involved with switching or changing things, and we want to make sure that we're really offering something that's better than what's already out there. So the questions that underlie the value test are the following. First question is, who will use it? So that's really thinking about who's going to adopt it. Of course, we want to think about who will pay for it, and those are really our funders, and in the Designing for Growth realm, they also call them customers. some of the questions that we can ask to dig into this if we're not sure is who saves money if I'm successful? And I think the money question for us as designers is who's downstream? Because what I've found is that a lot of times when we think about these large scale social problems, often the costs accrue over time, and there's someone who's sort of left, usually towards the end of the chain, holding the proverbial bag, so to speak. So it turns out that for a lot of times for homelessness, emergency rooms and hospitals end up taking a lot of that cost. In some instances, it might be the government who's taking on that cost. It might be different communities. Sometimes it might be state or federal governments that are sort of holding the responsibility for that and paying the check, so to speak. So that who's downstream question is huge. We can't always make the case for our work through downstream effects. If we did, we'd all have plentiful early education and prenatal care and those sorts of things. But it can really help to make the case, especially if we can find the right funder, and certainly can often help us get a foot in the door through pilots, especially when there are stakeholders that have a lot invested or are spending a lot of money. You also want to ask the question, who benefits? And there's sort of like three key managerial questions worth asking. So one is, am I offering improvement in quality? The other one is, am I making something more efficient? Am I saving people time? And then the other one that's pretty clear is, am I saving money somehow? Am I spending less? Am I reducing costs? And the other way to sort of think about this from a MBA perspective is, whose pain are you solving? So whose life are you making better? But if you can reduce your work down to any of these three things and make the case for how you're improving them along either quality, time, or financial metrics, you really stand a chance of making a good case to someone to buy into it, because you're really showing what's in it for them. Lastly, you want to look at kind of the cost drivers for development, implementation, and delivery. Each one of these phases have costs associated with it. Your R&D costs might be really high. It might cost you a lot in marketing to actually scale your work. There may be important technology that you need in the implementation phase. All of these things are things that you should be evaluating, and you want to really make sure that at every stage is, the things that are going to really drive the cost. Are they feasible? Have you accounted for them? Is the technology where you wanted to develop it? All of this is part of assessing whether or not you're delivering value and making sure that you're thinking about delivering value at every stage. Because also too, the cost drivers will help ultimately drive people's conclusions about what your work is going to cost and what your projects are really going to cost. And if you haven't properly assessed those, then you may overestimate the value of your work. So the other important test that they point out is the execution test. And they describe it as how your design or intervention will create and deliver the promised value, and what capabilities will it leverage. You must also identify which critical capabilities are missing and with whom you will partner with to attain them. This is so huge for us because, again, we don't have all the skills we need usually in ourselves. So this is really about critical capabilities, critical components, and figuring out how are you going to get those questions answered, or who's going to help you get to those things that you need. So in the execution test, you're going to ask a series of questions. Can you create it? Meaning the whole project in general. Do you know if your idea will work? And for me, this really hinges on, is the underlying technology sufficiently advanced? And things like, have your clinical practices, techniques, therapies been studied and tested? You want to make sure that your therapeutic approach is sound, and you want to make sure that if you are using something that's cutting edge, that it's been sufficiently developed, or that you think it will be sufficiently developed in time to meet your needs. You definitely want to ask, is there something that needs to be invented? Is there something that doesn't exist yet that has to be in place before my project will work? That's huge, and you want to make sure that that's deliverable. And then again, you want to go back to the cost, development, implementation, delivery, and ultimately scaling and diffusing your project. Because again, those costs drive execution in that process, and you want to make sure that you've taken that into account and that it's executable at all those levels. And lastly, you want to look into what are your known unknowns. So making sure that you have all the information that you need to assess whether different elements of your project will work. The Designing for Growth team tells us that the value and execution tests matter most at the early stages. So this is going to be pretty key for us as we're thinking about, going from design to feasibility to prototyping. So spend most of your time thinking about it. And I will say that categorically speaking, I've seen, quite a few DSW students go through different processes, and it always to me hinges on execution, that they often haven't fully thought that component through. More often than not, they have thought about what value does their project offer, but they really have not assessed every component of the execution and ensured that what they have in mind is doable and achievable. So there's the two other tests that the Designing for Growth team offers up, and these are the scale and defensibility tests. So scale, I think, is important for us because the question of will it scale is really huge. However, the defensibility test is kind of an interesting one. On one hand, they're coming from that market perspective, that capitalist perspective. And so they don't want you to be too easily copied. They don't want your ideas to be stolen and for you not to profit from them. You know, for us in the social impact realm, it's actually kind of an interesting question, right? Like sometimes we maybe want to be copied. We may want our ideas to be open source. We might love people to run with our idea. So it may actually be a question that we're actually looking for to say, is it, you know, shareable enough? Is it scalable and copyable enough? But we might also say, you know what, we want to be a unique offering in the marketplace. It's important for us to scale, and we want to make sure that we're not, you know, it's a way of assessing our uniqueness to some degree and how novel our ideas are. So it's a question I would definitely grapple with, which is how defensible is your project? So again, these questions distill back to who will be affected and how will they react, and are they capable of reacting quickly? So a little detail into the scale and defensibility test. The scale test really answers the questions, will it scale? Are there regulatory hurdles? Do you generate profit? Are there partners that can help? These are things that will ultimately dictate whether or not you are able to scale your project or scale your project quickly. Profit isn't a necessity, but the more we look at these high impact projects, having the ability to generate profit means that you have the ability to generate your own momentum. For the defensibility test, the questions are really, can you be copied easily? Can you be disrupted? Who wants you to fail? And I think for us, this is a really big one, right? So we may want to protect ourselves. It might be okay to be copied, but we also want to make sure that companies don't come in or organizations don't come in and shut us down because they actually don't want us to succeed in our work. And this happens sometimes with organizations in cases of major disruption. So real quick look at a couple other techniques that you can use to help you assess feasibility. And these are called backcasting or pre-mortems. And they're really sort of two versions of the same thing. Backcasting is an exercise that you really take a position, can be kind of run in a design land format where you say, we're in the future. How did we get here? Either how did we succeed or how did we fail? And really asking what were the steps that had to be put in place for that outcome to happen. Pre-mortems are sort of doing a pre-failure check. So it kind of asks the same question of if we were to fail, what would have to happen? They're basically the same question. It's just pre-mortems, I think, are a little bit more in kind of the present moment. They're sort of at a present state looking into the future. Backcasting actually takes us one step further to say, now you're in the future, now look back. So it's just a really different kind of cognitive way of thinking about where the failure points are in your project. And again, they just really answer the questions, why is your design going to fail, or why did your design fail? So here's kind of an example of how you would run that as a drill. It's 5 years post-graduation. Your idea was wildly successful. What does it look like now? What happened to get you there? What did you do well? What barriers did you overcome? How did you overcome them? And then the real feasibility component is it's 5 years post-graduation, but you didn't launch your capstone, or you launched it but didn't take off. Why didn't you launch it? What didn't you do? Or what did you do poorly? What barriers, expected or unexpected, did you encounter? And then you go back and really look at the answers and ask what they tell you about your assumptions and your process. Now, you'll notice that sort of I offer one track that isn't really the feasibility part. Often you use that just to make sure that you're thinking broadly and that your ideas have been inclusive, but it's good to have that foil. And it's good to start with the expansive part before you go to the why doesn't it work. It's a little bit hard to work in the other direction because of how our mindsets work. But they're really useful exercises, and I think you can get a lot of good discovery out of that. So that is feasibility assessment. I'm excited to see you work on this next week. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, either to me or your professors. Thanks so much.